Hi, I'm Paula, I'm 35 years old, and if anyone asks where I spend most of my life, I'll answer, between plans and windows, because I run a small design agency with a modest office in a business center where my employees work full-time, but my true workspace is my apartment, where I return after visiting construction sites, where I check on the progress of projects and decide which materials are best suited for which rooms, because it is in the silence of home that ideas are born and decisions are made that are then transformed into interiors for other people's homes. 6 months ago, I gave up my life as a tenant and bought my own 3 rooms, which I designed myself, following a strict minimalist principle: clean lines, calm neutral tones, and an organization that seemed to place everything in its place, didn't clash with neighbors, and helped me maintain peace of mind after years of constantly moving and remodeling other people's spaces, dreaming of my own order and a place to breathe. My family includes parents in their 60s, and my older sister, Domenica, married with her husband, Guido, and 2 boys, one 8, the other 6. We were never hostile to each other, we simply had different worlds and different rhythms, and although we got along, there wasn't much intimacy, but blood and duty held together bridges that sometimes seemed thin but strong. A week ago I had a housewarming party. The house was full of guests, everyone was laughing, eating, people were praising the thoughtfulness of the interior. My parents came, Domenica brought her family, and that evening it seemed to me that here it was, the long-awaited peace, soft, almost showroom-like, and I allowed myself to believe that now my home would always be like this. This morning, her phone rang, and her sister's voice rang with a request: "Paula, we need a favor. We're starting a major renovation, we have nowhere to live, we need somewhere to stay for about a month." There was such utter humanity in this request that my heart sank a little in surprise, because I'd grown accustomed to solitude and the measured space I'd built myself, but she spoke quickly and without panic, explaining that her parents' house was too small, that commuting from there to work with the kids and husband would be excruciating, and that my place, with 3 bedrooms and spacious living areas, was perfect. "We're only here for a month, I promise." I agreed to the condition, but asked for frugality. "Only take the essentials," I said, "leave the rest in my parents' garage or put it in storage." "Of course, thank you, Paula, you're saving us," she replied, and there was a gratitude in her voice that I didn't want to deny, because we are families, and sometimes concessions are measured not by convenience, but by love. 2 days later, I saw from the window a truck pull up to the house, and I watched as Domenica and Guido, collected and quick, began carrying out box after box. Within an hour, my living room, which I had long planned down to the smallest detail, was transformed into a chaos of stacks and packages, as if a hurricane had swept through the rooms. As I walked inside, I allowed myself to ask, "Domenica, what does this mean?" "I asked you to take only the essentials. My parents don't have space in the garage," she said calmly, "and storage is expensive. We'll try to keep it clean and tidy." But there were stacks of boxes everywhere. My usually empty and bright surfaces were occupied by catalogs and children's things, and my sense of home became entangled with the practicalities of someone else's need. Where would we sleep? How would we organize our daily life? Where would my habits hide? Domenica resolved the issue pragmatically. "Guido and I will take the guest room, the children will take your large bedroom, and you can temporarily work in the study." Obedient and slightly overwhelmed, I placed the crib in the study, gave my bedroom to the little ones, and the guest room to Domenica and Guido, because they asked not for convenience but for necessity. At that moment, it became clear to me that the understanding of familial duty did not cancel the pain of losing my own peace. And my carefully constructed and almost sacred space was completely violated. The first few days when my sister's entire family moved into my house were unexpectedly difficult for me, though I tried to keep a straight face and behave decently, not letting on that the noise and disorder were ruining the peace and quiet I'd worked so hard to achieve. The children, returning from school, seemed to forget they weren't in their own apartment, but in my carefully crafted space. They'd kick off their shoes in the hallway, run into each other's rooms, start yelling at each other, arguing, fighting over toys, and all of this filled the air with such a cacophony that I repeatedly caught myself wanting to run anywhere, just to be in peace. but I convinced myself it was only a month, and that I could handle it, even if it meant a little patience. Domenica seemed to care little about the mark her children left on my home. She worked part-time, taking the boys to school in the morning and staying in the office until 2 in the afternoon. Instead of returning home to tend to the children or at least make my life easier, she would go shopping or visit friends, leaving behind a faint trail of perfume and empty promises to return early. One afternoon, as I sat at my laptop, finishing an important project proposal for a new client, my 8-year-old nephew popped into my room and asked with such sincere eyes, "Aunt Paula, can you play with us?" I sighed deeply, trying to speak gently but firmly. "Sweetheart, I'm working right now, I can't, but we're bored. Mom said you'd look after us," came his reply, full of childish resentment, and at that very moment, the youngest's whining came from the other side. "Aunt Paula, I'm hungry," and without even thinking about it, I put my work aside, went into the kitchen, and started making them snacks. At first, it was even pleasant. I made little sandwiches, cut fruit, poured juice, set plates in front of them, and watched them eat with gusto. But after a week, I felt my strength waning, that I could no longer endlessly be nanny, cook, and patient aunt. One day, I told them point blank, "You're old enough to make your own sandwiches. The kitchen has everything you need." They exchanged awkward glances but didn't argue. A few days later, when I returned from the bathroom to the hallway, Domenica literally cornered me. "Paula, why do my kids eat nothing but peanut butter sandwiches all day?" Her voice was accusing, and I felt a wave of irritation rise inside me. "Because I'm trying to work, and they keep saying they're hungry," I replied. She threw up her hands. "But you're home all day." I paused, then said calmly but reservedly, "My home is my office. This is where I work, where I have deadlines, clients, and site visits. So what am I supposed to do with the kids then?" She persisted. "I don't know. Maybe I should take care of them myself instead of seeing my friends every day." I snapped, no longer hiding my weariness. I could see she didn't like my words, but I wasn't about to back down. The situation finally escalated when I had to go to an important inspection of a construction site 2 hours outside the city. The night before, I'd warned my sister, "I'll be gone all day tomorrow," but that morning, as I was getting ready to leave, Domenica suddenly started yelling, "You can't leave. What should I do with the kids?" I turned to her and calmly replied, "Take care of them, they're your kids." "But I have plans to meet Lisa for brunch," she said indignantly. "Then cancel your plans," I said, my voice colder than I expected. She flared up, "That's unfair, you're selfish." I took a deep breath and said one last thing, "Domenica, I'm going to work. This is what pays for the apartment you live in for free." She made a real scene, yelling, accusing me. But I went out anyway because I couldn't let my clients down. I couldn't ruin my reputation. I spent the entire day at the site, and when I returned home that evening, I was hoping for at least a couple of hours of silence, but instead I found my parents sitting on the couch in the living room, watching TV at a volume so loud the walls shook. Mom and Dad's hearing isn't what it used to be. They always turn everything up loud, and now the kids were running around the apartment, screaming and arguing, while Domenica, sitting in the corner, was talking on the phone and laughing loudly, as if nothing was happening. "Hi, Mom, hi, Dad, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to speak calmly. Domenica called and said she needed someone to watch the kids since you abandoned them, Mom replied. I almost laughed out loud in frustration. "Abandoned them?" "I went to work." "Well, here we are. Don't worry, we're already making dinner," she added so matter-of-factly, as if it all went without saying, and at that moment, I felt a strange mixture of relief and gratitude, because Mom set a large pot of stewed meat, side dishes, and vegetables on the table, and the aroma filled the apartment with a comfort I hadn't felt in many days. It was the first real, home-cooked, hot meal I'd had in a long time, and I found myself almost ready to cry from this simple and much-needed comfort. But now that my parents were coming every day to babysit, the atmosphere in my home had completely changed. Whereas before I'd at least tried to maintain control and stay grounded, the level of noise and chaos had become overwhelming. The TV was blaring, Mom and Dad were shouting over each other, the kids were running around the rooms, arguing and screaming, and Domenica was sitting in the corner with her phone, chatting incessantly. Everything was lost in the sounds, my thoughts, my plans, my work, even my breathing. Every afternoon, the apartment became a chaotic space, filled with noise and bustle, and I couldn't concentrate on anything, even though important deadlines loomed on the horizon and clients were waiting for my decisions. The only solace in all this chaos was that Mom, tired but caring in her own way, cooked dinner for all of us every night, and a hot meal really did make my life a little easier, bringing back a sense of normality, at least for a short time. That Saturday morning, I was supposed to leave for a renovation project an hour outside of town, a major project, a complete kitchen remodel, requiring oversight at every stage. I spent the entire day there, checking plans, verifying materials, explaining details to the builders, and by evening, as I returned home, I longed for nothing but silence so I could finally focus on work. But even as I approached the entrance, I heard noise coming from the courtyard, loud voices, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. It was clearly a party. At first, I thought I was mistaken, but as I walked through the apartment to the back window, I saw something that made me freeze for a moment. My parents were throwing a real celebration in my courtyard, a barbecue with music and dozens of guests. There were at least 15 people there, relatives, neighbors, even people I didn't know at all. They were sitting on my patio furniture, using my grill, and judging by the empty containers on the tables. They'd cooked a meal using the groceries I'd bought the day before, expecting to last a week. I stood there, watching, and only one thought was running through my head: how could they have done all this without my knowledge, in my house, in my yard? But I forced a smile, walked outside, and, without showing it, said cheerfully, "Hello everyone," because making a scene in front of so many people would have been humiliating. "Paula, honey, we're having a little fun," Dad called out, waving a skewer. "I hope you don't mind." I felt my stomach clench, but I answered out loud, "No problem, looks like you found everything you need." The party went on for about 2 more hours. I tried to lock myself in my room and work on my project plans, but the noise, laughter, music, and children's squeals permeated everything, making it impossible to concentrate. Finally, around 10 p.m., the last guests began to leave, and I went out into the courtyard, where the tables were littered with paper plates, empty bottles, leftover food, and cigarette butts. My parents were getting ready to leave, and I gathered my strength and said, "Mom, Dad, can you help me clean up?" But Mom sighed wearily, "Oh, honey, I'm so tired, it's been a long day. We need to go home." And just like that, they were gone. Domenica, Guido, and the children disappeared into their room without even trying to help, and I spent the next 2 hours alone, cleaning up after everyone, collecting bottles, carrying out bags, washing dishes, and looking out at my courtyard, which resembled a disaster zone. The next day, Sunday, my parents showed up again around noon. As if the chaos from the previous day had never happened, we came to watch the kids while Domenica goes grocery shopping, Mom announced cheerfully. I took a deep breath and, gathering my courage, said, "Actually, I need to talk to you about yesterday. You can't have parties at my house without asking me first." Dad immediately frowned and said with an offended expression, "Oh, come on, Paula, we were just having fun. You're such a loner. Sometimes you need some company around here." I looked him straight in the eye and said firmly, "I don't want any more parties here." Mom shook her head. "You're being ridiculous." At that moment, Domenica emerged from the room, sleepy, in her robe, and asked, "What's going on?" I replied, "I'm telling Mom and Dad there are no more parties at my house." She shrugged and said, "Paula, they just wanted to have a good time. You're being way too sensitive about it." "This is my home, Domenica," I said, feeling my voice tremble, even though I tried to speak calmly. "By the way, your promised month is almost up. When exactly are you planning to move back into your apartment?" The room fell silent at these words, and I noticed my sister's eyes widen slightly and her shoulders seemed to sag, as if she'd already known I'd ask exactly this. Guido, sitting next to me, suddenly found something extremely interesting on his phone and practically buried his head in it, just to avoid meeting my gaze. Domenica finally spoke. "Well, the thing is, we gave up on that apartment. After the renovations, the rent would be too high. We decided it wasn't worth it." Her words hit me like a stone in the stomach, and for a second I was speechless. I looked at my sister point blank. "And when were you planning to tell me about this?" I asked, trying not to scream. She spread her hands. "I'm telling you right now. Look, if we stay here for a couple more months, it won't be a big deal, right?" My parents nodded nearby, as if this was the most natural and sensible solution, and their eyes held a strange support for the idea, as if I should accept it all as a given. "Domenica, you said 1 month." I said slowly, as if afraid my words would be drowned out by another wave of noise. "Plans change, Paula, that's life," my sister replied, and I felt my patience finally crack. I stood up, went to my office, and opened my laptop. A firm decision was already brewing inside me. I had to get my house back. I dialed my friend Marcus, who works as a real estate agent. "Marcus, I need you to send me a list of 2-bedroom apartments for rent in the area where my sister used to live." He looked surprised, but answered quickly, "Sure, Paula, give me 10 minutes. When I returned to the living room, all eyes were on me. "What are you doing?" Domenica asked, her voice trembling. "Waiting for a list of apartments from Marcus," I replied calmly, and at that moment my phone vibrated. A new email. I forwarded it to my sister. "Here, 23 available apartments in your old neighborhood, start calling." Domenica's face flushed. "Paula, you're losing your mind. We're family. Family shouldn't do this." I raised my head. Family doesn't lie about how long they plan to stay. Family doesn't throw parties at someone else's house without permission. Family doesn't turn your sister into an unpaid babysitter while they spend time with their friends. My parents exchanged glances, and I saw my father clear his throat, looking away sheepishly. "Maybe we should go home today, Paula, let you sort this out yourselves." They left, leaving me, Domenica, and Guido in a heavy silence. My sister and her husband soon disappeared into their room and didn't emerge until evening, but through the walls I could hear their muffled arguments, snatches of words, and sighs. A week later, I found the utility bills in my mailbox. My electric bill usually ran under $100, but now it was $280. My water bill had jumped from $45 to $95. The gas bill had tripled, and I felt all my anger welling up inside me again. I grabbed a calculator and calculated my grocery bill. I usually spent about $200 a month, but last month it was $800, and that didn't even include the supplies destroyed at the barbecue. That night, while sitting at dinner, I couldn't stand it any longer and made an announcement. I was looking over the bills. "If you don't move out next month, we need to implement new rules. You'll pay me $1,000 in rent plus half of all grocery expenses." Domenica nearly choked on her food. $1,000? Are you crazy? I looked at her calmly. "That's a reasonable price for 4 more people." Guido looked up from his plate. "We won't pay you rent. We're family." "Fine," I replied coldly. "Then you have exactly 2 weeks to find another place to live. After that, I'm changing the locks." At that very second they jumped up and almost ran into their room, loudly slamming the door behind them, leaving me alone at the table among the plates and thoughts about how my house would once again need to be reclaimed from my own relatives. The next day, my parents showed up at the door and didn't even have time to take off their coats before they started yelling at me as if I were a teenager instead of a grown woman with a home, a job, and a life of her own. "You can't throw your sister out on the street," my mother exclaimed, her voice shaking with indignation and, at the same time, with some kind of resentment I couldn't understand. I replied calmly but firmly, "She's not out on the street, she has options, she just chose not to take them." But my mother didn't listen. She clung to her thought and repeated over and over again, "You're cruel, Paula, cruel." I took a deep breath and said calmly, "I'm being reasonable. This is my home, and I decide who lives here." My father frowned, his eyes turning stern. "We raised you better." I chuckled, though inside I was bitter. "You raised me to stand up for myself. That's what I'm doing." They left, hurt and confused, clearly hoping that in a day or two I would cool down and change my mind, but inside me, there was no doubt. For the next few days, a strange silence reigned in the house. Neither Domenica nor Guido said a word to me, and I didn't complain. After a week of noise and endless conversations, this silence seemed almost a blessing. The air in the house became cleaner, my thoughts clearer. And for the first time in a long time, I could work peacefully in my office, hearing only the clicking of keys and my own breathing. Then came the moment when I had to leave for 3 days to another city to oversee a large project. It was serious commercial work that required my full attention, and I left, trying to push away thoughts of what might be happening at home. But when I returned on Thursday evening and heard the hum of voices, music, and laughter from the car, everything inside me collapsed. I walked into the apartment and froze. About 20 people, most of whom I'd never seen in my life, were sprawled out in my living room, drinking, dancing, and talking loudly, as if this were their home and not mine. "What the hell is going on here?" I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the general din. I raised my voice. "Everyone needs to leave now." Domenica, barely able to stand, a glass of wine in hand, approached me with a wide, goofy smile. "Oh, come on, Paula, don't be such a bore." I raised my hand. "This is my house, and I want everyone out immediately. If you don't like it, you can leave yourself." She swayed and muttered incoherently, "Now this is our home too." Everyone turned to me, and I felt dozens of strangers' eyes on me. Some guy I didn't even know shouted, "Get lost." And the room erupted in laughter, whistles, and cheers. It was a moment when I could have pulled out my phone and called the police, but I knew I didn't want to cause a scene with a dozen drunk people who couldn't control themselves. I grabbed my purse and left, trying not to show how much I was seething. I spent the night at the hotel, in a small room that smelled of fresh linen, and the silence was so thick I wanted to wrap myself in it like a blanket. In the morning, I returned home, and the house greeted me not with joy, but with devastation. Trash was strewn everywhere, empty bottles rolled across the floor, cigarette burns were on the table, the furniture was stained with sauces and wine. I felt my anger give way to cold determination. I took out the boxes and suitcases and methodically began packing Domenica and her family's belongings. I acted as if I were at work. I folded clothes neatly, sorted the children's toys into boxes, and stacked the books. Every item had its place, every single thing was folded as if I were doing it for a client, not for the sister who had betrayed my trust. By noon, everything they'd brought with them, along with all the junk that had accumulated over the past month and a half, stood by the door, ready to be taken out. And then I heard the sound of keys. Domenica walked in with the children, smiling, but the smile instantly vanished when she saw the boxes and suitcases. "Paula, what are you doing? You can't kick us out. We have nowhere to go." Her voice trembled, and her eyes filled with tears. I replied firmly, "You should have thought of this before throwing a party in my house and kicking me out. I warned you. You have 2 weeks to find a place to live." The children stood nearby, confused, looking from their mother to me, and my heart sank with pity. They were innocent in all this, their little faces terrified, and I understood that they would be the ones to fall victim to adult irresponsibility. Domenica, already crying, reached out to me. "Please, Paula, I'm sorry, it won't happen again." I looked at her coldly and said, "You're right, it won't happen again. Because you won't live here anymore." She sobbed louder, pleading and promising, but this time her tears had no power. I had already made my decision, and I knew there was no turning back. An hour after Domenica and her family left, my parents called, and I heard their voices even before I picked up. They were shouting so loudly that it seemed as if they were standing right next to me, in my living room. "How dare you throw your sister out?" My mother's voice broke with indignation, so full of condemnation and reproach that my insides sank. I didn't argue or make excuses. I simply hung up, because I realized that any words would only fan the flames. They called back 5 more times in a row, but I stared at the flickering screen and didn't pick up, deciding to save my nerves by letting them scream into the void. For the rest of the week, the silence I so desperately craved reigned in the house. No one spoke to me. Domenica and Guido seemed to have vanished into their own walls. The children stopped asking questions and demanding attention, and the parents no longer came to keep an eye on them. And honestly, it was the most peaceful time I'd had in the entire last month. I felt almost guilty for enjoying this peace, but deep down I knew, in this silence, I was finding myself again. The following Wednesday, I had to travel to another city for a project that required my oversight. it was a luxury apartment renovation for one of my most important clients, and I couldn't afford the slightest mistake, so I went myself to personally ensure the tiling was done as planned. 3 hours of travel there, several hours of work on site, meticulous inspections, and conversations with the builders, and another 3 hours back, when I finally returned home around 10 o'clock in the evening. Tired and exhausted, I was greeted by a silence so profound that I immediately realized something had changed. I entered the apartment and paused. Everything was empty, no boxes, no suitcases, no children's toys, no clothes draped over shelves, nothing. While I was gone, they had gone. My living room had become a living room again, filled with my furniture, my books, and my things, not someone else's endless bags and scattered socks. My bedroom was back, and for the first time in a long time. I saw it as I'd left it, not after someone had broken in and rearranged everything. My office was an office again, not a temporary bedroom for other people's children. They left no note, no farewells, not even a laughable attempt at an explanation. They certainly didn't leave money to cover the electricity, water, or food bills I'd been spending 4 times as much as usual these past few months. But honestly, I didn't care. I felt only immense relief. The walls were mine again, the air in the apartment was mine. I could once again manage my time and space as I wished. I spent the weekend deep cleaning, and it was almost like a soul cleaning. I washed the carpets until they were fresh, scrubbed the bathroom until it sparkled, and rearranged the furniture the way I'd long dreamed of, but never quite got around to it. It was as if I was reclaiming every corner, every shelf, every item. By Sunday evening the apartment was sparkling clean and looked exactly the same as it had on the day before Domenica had even crossed my threshold with her suitcases. The next 2 months passed surprisingly calmly. Neither Domenica, nor Guido, nor even my parents showed up or called, as if they had all conspired to pretend I didn't exist. I threw myself into work, and it turned out that without the constant noise and chaos, I could be more productive than ever. I completed 2 major projects, hired another employee, and even began thinking about expanding the office. Everything that had been weighing me down seemed to disappear, and I felt life regaining meaning and rhythm. And then one Saturday morning, I heard a knock on the door. I cautiously peered through the peephole and saw my mother. She was standing there with a plate in her hands, and my heart fluttered. There was something familiar in that gesture, something from the past, when we were just family. I opened the door. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, darling," she said, handing over the plate. "Your favorite, strawberry rhubarb." I picked up the pie and placed it on the kitchen table, then looked at her. "What's going on, Mom?" She walked slowly into the living room, sat down on the sofa, and looked around the apartment. "Paula, we need to apologize to you," she began, her voice quieter than usual. I felt a tension slide down my spine. An apology from Mom was rare, and then she said the words that stunned me. 2 weeks ago, we kicked Domenica and her family out of the house." I froze. "You kicked them out?" I asked, incredulous. Mom sighed heavily. "We couldn't stand it anymore. Every morning, she'd drop the kids off with us and disappear for hours, meeting friends, going shopping, doing whatever. She never helped around the house, buying groceries, or cooking." I smiled bitterly. "Sounds familiar." Mom nodded. "She left us with her children, and lived as if everything would work out on its own, and Guido wasn't much better. He'd come home from work, sit on the couch, and watch TV. How long did they stay with you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though old grievances and memories were still seething inside me. 2 months, Mom sighed, her hands resting wearily on her knees. 2 months of chaos, incessant noise, and exhaustion. The children run and scream from morning until night, knowing no rest or boundaries. Domenica chatters on the phone all day as if she has no other responsibilities, and Guido eats everything in the fridge and never even tries to restock. "What about the bills?" I asked, knowing full well what I'd hear, but wishing Mom would say it herself. "Doubled, just like yours," she replied bitterly. "We even had to pay for groceries with your father's credit card because we couldn't handle feeding 4 more mouths." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief and bitter justice well up inside me. "Now you understand," I said quietly, "why I couldn't let them stay here forever." Mom looked at me for a long moment and nodded. We understand perfectly well, Paula, you were right to set boundaries. We should have supported you back then, not sided with them. Where do they live now? I asked, less out of curiosity than out of a desire to complete the picture. They found a small apartment on the other side of town, Mom replied. 2 bedrooms, an older house. The neighborhood isn't as nice as yours, of course. Domenica complains that it's cramped and uncomfortable, but I think she'll adjust. She'll adjust, I repeated, my voice laced with steely confidence. We hope so too, Mom sighed. Paula, your father and I are so sorry. We should have listened to you from the start. I looked at her carefully. Mom's face seemed drawn. A weariness I hadn't noticed before had appeared in her eyes. Caring for Domenica's family, the constant workload and disappointment, were clearly wearing her down. I appreciate your apology, Mom, I said sincerely, I really do, and now we can be a family again. Of course, she nodded. But I want you to understand, I paused and said firmly, my home is my home. You no longer have to think about throwing parties here or deciding who stays over. Absolutely, Mom quickly replied, we understand it all completely now. And what about Domenica? I asked, though I could already sense the answer. Mom's face fell slightly, as if she'd been caught thinking something she didn't want to voice. She's still angry with you, she admitted after a pause. She blames you for all her housing problems. She says you put them in a difficult situation. I smiled bitterly. Mom, she lied to me about giving up the apartment, I reminded her. She left me to look after her children while she went out with her friends. She threw parties at my place and kicked me out of my own house. I know, dear, Mom said softly, almost apologetically. I know, she's not ready to take responsibility for her actions yet. We sat in the living room for about an hour, talking, the first normal, warm conversation between mother and daughter in months. My mother told me the latest family news, shared small joys, asked about my work, and her words were so genuinely compassionate that for a moment I felt as if we'd returned to the simple, trusting times of our relationship. When she stood up to leave, she unexpectedly hugged me tightly, the way not only mother and daughter embrace, but also people who have longed for closeness. We missed you, Paula, she said, her voice trembling. The house felt empty without you. I missed you too, Mom, I replied, feeling a warmth spreading in my chest. After she left, I was left alone in my quiet, clean apartment. A strawberry and rhubarb pie awaited me on the kitchen table. I cut myself a slice, sat down on the sofa, and took my first bite. The taste was exactly like childhood, sweet, tart, and filled with memories of summer days, laughter, and warmth. I was glad my parents were back in my life, but even happier that I'd stood my ground and not allowed my family to turn my kindness into a means of convenience. From that moment on, things gradually began to return to normal. We began gathering around the big table on Sundays again, just like we had before all this mess with Domenica. It was wonderful to renew old traditions and feel like a family again. During these dinners, no one ever brought up Domenica, and I didn't either. It was like an unspoken agreement. We would focus on rekindling the warmth and closeness, rather than delving into the drama that was tearing us apart. Meanwhile, my work was going better than ever. Without constant interruptions, screaming children, and chaos, I could focus and move forward. I took on new projects, more ambitious and interesting than before, and even signed a contract to design the interiors of an entire residential complex, 12 apartments in one project. It was the largest project I'd ever received, and I knew a new chapter lay ahead. I also started dating a new man, and it happened so naturally and effortlessly, as if time itself had decided to reward me with the opportunity to start over. His name was Leopoldo, and he was a contractor with whom we'd collaborated several times on large projects. We were both busy, but one day, after a long day at a construction site, he suggested we take a stroll around the city, explore the old streets, and then we stopped at a small restaurant, where, accompanied by live music, we shared stories and laughed as if we'd known each other not just for a few weeks, but for a lifetime. This first meeting gradually turned into dinners, long conversations, and a trust that, over time, grew into something more than just a working relationship. One day, I told him the whole story with Domenica, what I'd been through in my own home, and he just shook his head with that look on his face that comes from someone who's seen too much to be surprised. You did the right thing, Paula, he said firmly. I've seen too many people let their families take advantage of them financially, and it always ends the same way, in pain and hurt. I sighed and admitted, sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh with them, but he stopped me with a gentle look. They lied to you about how long they'd be staying in your house, they doubled your bills, they left you to babysit while your sister was out with friends, and then they threw a party and kicked you out of your own apartment. You weren't cruel, you were just protecting yourself. His words were true, and I understood it, but still, the feeling of emptiness from the breakup with my sister never left me, and, oddly enough, it was this emptiness that sometimes seemed heavier than all the arguments and fights that had come before. About 6 months after my mother's visit, I bumped into Guido at the grocery store. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, with tired eyes and a somewhat embarrassed expression. When he saw me, he almost took a step back, but then quietly said, "Hi, Paula." I nodded. "Hi, Guido, how are you?" He shrugged. "Everything's fine, the new apartment is smaller than we'd like, but we're managing," I replied calmly. "Fine," but he clearly had no intention of leaving, and after a pause, he said, "Listen, I wanted to tell you something. I know things got out of hand when we were staying with you." I tried to interrupt him. "It's okay, Guido," but he interrupted with unexpected firmness. "No, Paula, it wasn't okay. Domenica back then and I too, we weren't honest or considerate. We took advantage of your generosity, and I'm sorry." It was the first sincere apology I'd heard from anyone in their family, and it touched me deeper than I expected. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, and at that moment, gratitude flickered in his eyes, and then he added, "The children sometimes ask about you, they miss their Aunt Paula." These words struck me more deeply than I could have imagined. My heart sank, and I quietly admitted, "I miss them too. Maybe someday we can work things out." "Maybe," he nodded, but I knew that wasn't possible yet, because Domenica still blamed me for everything and, as my parents said, didn't even try to look at the situation honestly. A year passed, my business continued to grow, as if it were taking on new life along with me. Leopoldo and I got engaged, and this became a new source of joy, confidence, and warmth that filled my life. I bought a small apartment by the sea, where I could relax on weekends, listening to the sound of the surf and enjoying the peace. Life became what I dreamed of, stable, filled with love and confidence in the future. And then one evening I got a call from my mother. Her voice was filled with excitement. "Paula," she said, "Domenica and Guido are getting divorced." I froze. "What? Why?" My mother sighed. "I don't know all the details, but it looks like it's a financial issue. Guido is tired of Domenica's endless spending and her unwillingness to take responsibility for anything." I asked, almost in a whisper, "What about the kids? Where will they live?" Mom explained, "With Guido for now. Domenica moved in with friends across town. She works part-time at a clothing store." Basically, it's the same old story. I felt genuinely sorry for the children, who were once again caught up in an adult crisis, but I couldn't say I was surprised. This was just like my sister, who had never been good with money and constantly shied away from responsibility. "Did she ask you and Dad for help?" I asked. Mom nodded. "Yes, she tried to move in with us again, but we said no. We learned our lesson." I smiled, albeit a little sadly. "Good job, Mom." Mom continued. "She's been calling all her relatives, trying to find someone who could take her in. So far, no luck." Rumors of what had happened when she lived with me and then with my parents had probably already spread around the neighborhood, because people love to explain away other people's misfortunes and season them with speculation. But Domenica, too proud to ask me for help or admit her own mistake, chose silence and resentment, remaining convinced that I had ruined her life by throwing her out of my house. I knew, however, that the landlord of her previous apartment had not been responsible for the renovations, that she had given up the apartment without any explanation to me, that she had left me to babysit her children while she went shopping and met with friends, and that the truth was more complex than the simplified stories that were now discussed over cups of coffee and on the benches in the entryway. "I know, dear," my mother would say. And there was a hint of regret in those words, but also recognition, because over time, everything became clearer. 6 months passed, and then came Leopoldo and I, a warm, simple celebration by the water, a small lakeside venue, about 50 guests, sun and food, and my parents arrived, genuinely happy, while Domenica wasn't on the guest list. My mother said she wouldn't have come anyway, still angry and thinking I was somehow to blame. During the reception, my father took me aside, put his hand on my shoulder, and quietly said, "I'm proud of you, Paula, you built a good life for yourself." I replied that I was grateful for those words and only regretted that it had taken us so long to understand that by making endless allowances, we had made it easier for her to avoid responsibility, and when she had to face life head-on, she couldn't cope because no one had set boundaries first. Now, 2 years after the chaos began, I live differently. My apartment is clean and quiet again, Leopoldo is by my side, my business is picking up, and my relationships with the family members who truly respect me have become warm and understanding. Then, one ordinary day, my phone suddenly vibrated, a message from my mother. Domenica was kicked out of her friend's house. Can she stay with us again? I asked briefly, what did you tell her? And my mother answered honestly and firmly, we said no, we're too old for this chaos. I often think about how boundaries, built with love and firmness, give people a chance to change, but not at the expense of your own life. Sometimes such boundaries seem cold to others, but they are precisely where self-care lies. My house is in order again, and I sleep peacefully, without waking up to other people's voices or counting their bills, and this feeling of freedom has proven more valuable than many of the concessions demanded of me. I put my phone down, looked around the living room. Clean, organized, and quiet, and felt relief mingle with certainty. Sometimes people think that cutting off contact with family members makes you a bad person, but I realized that you can't help those who don't want to accept help, and you can't build relationships with those who see you only as a source of resources. Domenica made her choice, and I made mine. I chose to protect my peace of mind, my home, and my financial stability, and I've never regretted it. The family you choose is the people who respect your boundaries, celebrate your success, and support you, and I was living proof that you can be happy and successful without tolerating other people's failures, even if those people are your own family.